How's the volume on this? All of you who can't hear me, raise your hands. That's pretty bad. Okay. Can the powers that be raise the gain on it, or do I have to play like a rock star all evening? Okay. All right. But Karen, wherever you are, if we can get the volume raised on this, it would help a great deal. For those of you who know how to find Karen or whatever. But I'd rather have my hands free for a while gesturing. Thank you, Russell. That was a nice introduction. I got very worried when they told me that Russell introduced me. Because getting introduced by people who actually know you can turn out to be very unusual at times. I'm remembering a time in the early 1970s when at the University of California, Davis, we got the Extension Division to sponsor a weekend symposium on extrasensory perception. And this was really incredible that such a thing could be. And of course, I was terribly concerned about the respectability of it. So it turned out that a friend of Russell's and mine, Arthur Hastings, was the master of ceremonies for the entire procedures, introducing all the people. And he'd been around long enough that he was tired of introducing people by all the usual academic titles and accomplishments and all that. So he had found out all the speakers' birth dates, and he introduced each person by pulling out a copy of Zolar's Your Horoscope. I was so embarrassed. It was even more embarrassing when he introduced me, and what he read out was reasonably accurate. Especially when Zolar concluded that people of this type would probably become leaders of the lunatic fringe. Follow me. Paul mentioned earlier that I was probably going to talk about the handout, the Archives of Scientists' Transcendent Experience. I'm not. Don't have time to, but I think all of you have gotten that handout, and I'm asking your help on that to publicize it. I depend pretty much on word of mouth to bring these scientists out of the woodwork to confess their spiritual experiences and to educate people. It's really a very subversive project. I'm out to destroy the stereotype that scientists have no souls. It's off to a nice start, but any publicity you can do. My first knowledge of remote viewing came through conversations with Russell back in the early 1970s. And eventually meeting Hal Puthoff also, in the very early days of the SRI program. Now, I had heard about the descriptions of the remote viewing, and they sounded pretty good, but I was still a little bit skeptical. At that time, there were several parapsychologists in the San Francisco Bay Area, which was something of a paranormal phenomenon in itself, since there were so few of us around. And we had regular monthly meetings at my house for a couple of years to talk about various research projects. So one evening, Russ and Hal said they would not only report on the remote viewing research they were doing at SRI, they would demonstrate remote viewing for us. I thought, oh, okay. So they told us they had selected half a dozen possible target sites in the Berkeley area and guided us through a little viewing session where we wrote down impressions and all that. And then afterwards took us out to see the target site. Well, we got out there, it was a laundromat down on University Avenue, and I'm being a little bit skeptical about this new technique. I thought, well, yeah, this element fits what I saw and all that. And I was wandering around in front of it, and suddenly I got to one spot, and it all clicked in. Oh, this is the exact angle I viewed the whole thing from, and now everything makes sense. That's for those rotating wire cages. That was the dryers. Oh, of course. It impressed me about remote viewing. Got my attention. And I eventually went on to have the privilege of working with Russ and Hal on the SRI project in those early days. Now, at that time, I was still very much in what I like to call the old paradigm of parapsychology, and Russell was partly too. When he and I had first met, remote viewing hadn't been invented yet, as it were, but we both had considerable knowledge of the old parapsychological experiments, talked about them at great length. Now, paradigm really means that you get a certain worldview set in, as there's an obvious way to solve certain problems and you expect certain kinds of answers, and every sensible person does it that way. It's what happens to a scientific theory when you start getting kind of mental ossification And instead of realizing you've just got your best guess at the truth at the moment, you start to see the natural truth of things. It's a very tricky psychological change. So the old paradigm changed, and what I'm going to talk to you about mainly tonight was an attempt at a new paradigm which almost but didn't quite make it, and the remote viewing paradigm made it instead as the dominant paradigm in parapsychology. And I'm going to talk about it not simply because history is interesting per se, but because there's an important question running through it that still applies in the remote viewing stuff. I also promise you I'm not going to get too technical. I learned after one or two mistakes at after-dinner talks that after dinner is not the time for heavy-duty data and difficult analysis. The question that runs through the old paradigm and still in the new paradigm is how do you make extrasensory perception work strongly and reliably? A really important question. The old paradigm. If I could have the first slide, please. Well, actually, this is my cartoon slide, and if the gentleman in the blue shirt would move forward. This is just an astral projection joke. The doctors are asking whether this guy's ever going to come back so they can decide whether to pronounce him dead or not. But that's not really the first slide I want to show you. If you would push the forward button on that, and also the power button can go forward one more notch. It is. It doesn't look very bright from the side.
Too much light.
Yes. Is there a way? It is on full power. Is there a way to turn out any? Ask and you shall be answered. Wonderful. Okay. The old paradigm was very much brought into existence by Joseph Banks Rhine. I'm sure practically everybody is familiar with that name, maybe some of the very youngest people. He was an amazing person. He was both the experimental leader of the field in introducing quantitative methods into parapsychology, whereas before that it was largely dealing with anecdotes or experiments that were very difficult to evaluate. And he was also sort of the moral, financial, organizational kind of leader of the field for many, many years. Those of us who knew him admired him greatly and were all angry about him something or another because he was a man in a difficult position. He became a little paranoid in his old age, but he was being persecuted, which tends to make you sticky about certain things. The next slide shows one of his partners, J.G. Pratt, who was also very much involved in the old paradigm. That's a hard one to see, being a little dim, but you can see everybody looks very proper in these things. Things were very proper. The next slide is the Duke University Parapsychology Laboratory, where the old paradigm largely came out. The next slide. The next slide, I have great affection for the old paradigm in the Duke University Parapsychology Laboratory here because of the activities at this laboratory. I met the lady who's operating the slide projector and married her, and we're still here. I was a very lady who had an interest in parapsychology and hypnosis, and I hypnotized her. It took me about 30 years to figure out who hypnotized who. And I'm not out of trance yet. The paradigm that got started through the efforts of Ryan's laboratory is the one shown in the next slide of card guessing, of quantitative experiments where you could quite precisely, you would push the button please, love? Where you could quite precisely measure what was happening. These are, most people call them the ESP cards. Technically they're the Zener cards because a professor at Duke, Carl Zener, suggested these designed as 5 quite discriminable but relatively neutral geometric sort of designs, and these came in decks of 25, 5 of each. Figured out pretty quickly that the chance on this would be getting 5 out of 25, and the statistics were very well figured out for what was a significant score above chance. Enormous numbers of experiments were done in this card guessing paradigm, and in many ways it was a major advance from the earlier stuff that had done before that. It had its technology. The next slide, for instance, shows you automatic card shuffling machines in the upper part there, ignore the lower part thing, in order to shuffle these things, because a lot of cards were shuffled and a lot of people guessed at them. So I say this was very useful because you could precisely quantify the amount of ESP you had in experiments. And that meant you could do functional experiments to see what affected ESPs. Did a cup of coffee beforehand help? Well, okay, if the average shifted from 5.7 to 5.9, was a small effect, but it could be very precise and you could know it was happening. Most of the evidence that showed that ESP existed came about through these card guessing tests, and some hints as to its psychological nature. One of these hints, for instance, was in one of the most replicatable effects in the field known as the decline effect. Whoever you tested on these card guessing tests gradually got worse and worse with practice and eventually declined to chance performance. Now, partially it was boredom. We're intellectual enough to be able to attribute significance to guessing cross wave, cross star wave, whatnot. But after the first 10, 20,000 times of doing this, the significance you're able to project into it tends to wear somewhat thin. So partially the decline effect was partly due to boredom. People doing this over and over again, they lost interest, and then they could show if you did things that artificially stimulated their interest, the scores would peak back up for a while and so forth. But still, even subjects who seemed to be motivated and interested eventually could only score at chance. Since chance doesn't get tired, this was excellent evidence for the existence of ESP. People get tired, people change and whatnot, so the decline effect was due that way. Now the almost new paradigm, what might have happened? I've been interested in parapsychology since I was a teenager. For me it was a very interesting way to reconcile my interest in science and religion and try to find some methods to sort out the wheat from the chaff and whatnot. So I followed this parapsychological literature very closely, and the main problem was that while in general experiments gave significant results, the phenomenon was very unreliable and very weak. Again, using those Zener cards as an example, guessing 5 was your chance baseline, and someone who could consistently average 5.75 over a long period of time might be statistically very significant, but most people as individuals couldn't even average that high. So most of the experimental results came from groups of people, and it really meant that 99% of the time people were guessing, and every once in a while a flash of ESP came through that identified another card. It was enough to tell us it was there. But if you wanted to study what ESP was, it wasn't very useful. The analogy I've always used is that the study of ESP through these kind of multiple choice card tests was very much like where our study and knowledge of electricity was for almost all of human history. You had lightning, okay? We had spontaneous psychic experiences. You dream of someone who's just died, it's like lightning, bam! Really impressive, and it's over. And you've just got your memory of it. So we had spontaneous cases which you couldn't produce on demand, and you just had people's memories. It was also known that if you had a piece of amber and rubbed it with some fur, sometimes you could then pick up a feather with the piece of amber. Didn't always work. Well, that was our card guessing test. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't, and it was a kind of weak effect. Our science of electricity didn't move along very far until the electric battery came along. Compared to lightning, a battery is not terribly impressive, but compared to that unreliable amber and fur, a battery is incredible. You can get a steady flow of electricity any day in the laboratory, and in no time at all, historically speaking, we developed a science of electricity. So I've always thought we need the parapsychological battery. We need something that anytime you go in the laboratory, a certain amount of ESP will happen, and then you can find out what affects it, what does it do, what are its properties, and so forth. I kept this in mind all through college. I did start out wanting to be an electrical engineer. I had a lot of trouble with calculus and chemistry, and also discovered at that time it was possible to become a psychologist. I hadn't known that. And a psychologist was close to being a parapsychologist, which is what I actually wanted to do. So I switched to the University of North Carolina and did my graduate work in psychology there. Now, my thesis and dissertation work was on sleep and dreams and the new discoveries about how you can measure with the EEG when a person is probably dreaming had come along. So I was spending a lot of nights staying up all night while my subjects slept and waking them at certain times and seeing if the hypnosis had affected the dreams and the like. But I still had coursework to do, so I was sometimes a little bit loose at my 8 o'clock in the morning course on learning. I remember I frequently apologized to the instructor. If I said anything a little out of it today, I'm really kind of sleep deprived. But I learned a lot about ordinary learning, and I began to think about that in terms of maybe the problem is we've been thinking about testing ESP when we really need to be thinking about learning to use ESP. Well, this interest stayed with me, but I didn't have any chance to do anything about it while I was in graduate school. I then got a postdoctoral fellowship. I was actually going to go out to the Menninger Foundation and do a postdoctoral fellowship with Gardner Murphy, who was a quite well-known psychologist who had a definite interest in parapsychology, and who also had written a book on Asian psychology. He thought we might have something to learn from people in Asia about psychology. Well, my advisors at the University of North Carolina were horrified that an impressionable young man like me, who already had some weird ideas, would be exposed to a wild man like Gardner Murphy out in Kansas. So they got me a fellowship and sent me to California at the peak of the psychedelic revolution, where I was and of course, that's where I met people like Russell. Now, it was really interesting talking to Russell, because Russell was the only other parapsychologist I ever met who was also thinking about how do you teach ESP instead of how do you just test it. And we've both been independently thinking about ways you could begin to train this. We started a parapsychology research group together, which is still going after these many, many years. We had a lot of very interesting times. My fellowship ran out. Paradise was lost, and I had to leave California and go back to the East Coast. But I had written up my thoughts on how you could teach ESP in an article called Card Guessing Test, Learning Paradigm or Extinction Paradigm. This came out in the Journal of the American Society for Psychical Research in 1966. If you go to my website, not the TASTE website, but my personal website, which is linked to the TASTE website, the text of that article appears there. Russell published an article about the same time in an engineering journal on the same basic approach. Now, what is this approach? The basic way of looking at this in terms of learning is this. If someone says to you, I want you to demonstrate ESP, to use telepathy or something like that, I think an intelligent person's response should be, huh? Do what? Now see, if somebody says, use your little finger to tap the exact middle of the back of your head, you can all do that, even though you may have never done that before, because it's a minor variation on a very well-learned repertoire of actions. But it's not like we've all had lots of practice using dozens of different forms of ESP, and when somebody wants to test you in a certain way, it's just some minor variation. What are you supposed to do? Should you squint? Should you relax? Should you say mantras? And what are you supposed to do? So the learning theory approach says, assume that people have a potential for ESP, but they probably haven't learned anything about having to use it. So there's not much point in just jumping in and testing them. You've got to develop that potential for learning. Well, how do we learn almost anything? We learn it through feedback. We learn it by trying something and noticing the consequences of our actions. How do I learn the right amount of force to pick up this tray with one hand at the edge, which I've never picked up before? I try, and if I'm not trying quite hard enough, the thing is sagging, and if I'm trying too hard, it's coming up too high and getting out of control. But I'm getting feedback all the time on exactly what I'm doing. That's how we learn to walk. That's how we learn to do practically everything in life. We didn't know exactly what to do, but we tried something, and it didn't work. We tried something else until the feedback we got on the consequences of our actions showed us that, hey, we were getting somewhere. Let's refine this particular approach. So my basic idea was that if somebody says use ESP to view something or guess at the deck of cards or something like that, you can try something. But the idea is then, keep track of what did you try. Did you squint? Notice the results. Were you right or wrong? If you find out you're always wrong when you squint and try to use ESP, you've learned something very valuable. If you have to keep squinting, don't even try to use ESP. Wait till it goes away. If you've learned that a feeling of certainty means you're right half the time, Good. Try to examine what that feeling certainly is exactly like. Are there shades of it? When should you act on it? When shouldn't you act on it? That is, with feedback and keeping track of your internal state, you can learn what's helpful and what's not helpful. And so you can go from having to say, when somebody asks you to do this, up to knowing what to do to change your state to do the appropriate thing. The standard ESP testing procedure with cards had no immediate feedback like that. You guess through an entire deck of these 25 cards, and then maybe they were scored. But how could you learn in that situation? Let's see, there was one time when you were really confident. Was that on the 13th try or the 15th try? Because you were wrong on the 13th, but right on the 15th. That is, there were so many events intervening before you got any feedback about what the consequences of what you did were, that you couldn't make any sensible association as to how to use your ESP abilities more effectively. The lack of that feedback, incidentally, is due to a technical reason. You can't simply have somebody guess at a card and then tell them right or wrong, because what they'll learn is card counting. All the waves have been used up, so I won't guess waves anymore, and your score will go up, and that will make it look impressive, but that's not ESP. You can do it through what's called an open deck. You make your deck of 25 cards up by taking, say, 100 decks and shuffling them all together, which means an awful lot of shuffling, and randomly drawing a set of 25, so you can't make a guess as to what's been used up and whatnot, but that's pretty cumbersome. So the standard delayed feedback in multiple choice guessing, card guessing, simply didn't allow for learning to take place. But there were two confounding factors in here that make learning a little bit more complicated. Okay, remember, here's the basic model. You decide to try something, you keep sort of mental notes, what did I do, how did it feel, did it turn out to be right or wrong, and you eventually make up a little catalog in your head of what's a good state to guess in and what's a bad state. But when you have a multiple choice guessing thing like this, you're right part of the time by chance. So a fifth of the time in these 5 choice card tests, you're right, you got a hit, but those were actually due to chance. So when you make the connection that I did so-and-so and now I got a hit, that's actually misinformation that's going to confuse you. So any multiple choice test has a certain amount of confusion built into it, which is going to make learning harder. The second factor that goes along with that is you can certainly think of an extreme if you have a lot of talent to begin with on something like this. Most of the hits you make are going to be due to ESP rather than chance, and you will have a good chance at learning. But how talented do you have to be before the confusion of false feedback from hits that are due just to chance is cut out by correct responses due to ESP that give you an idea of how to go about this? It's what I call the talent threshold. There has to be some minimal level of talent to begin with before feedback's likely to be effective. And I never figured out any way to figure that out theoretically. That's just something that has to be figured out empirically. So this theory leads to a prediction, several predictions, okay? And these predictions are about motivated percipients, motivated people trying to be psychic. If they're not motivated, if they don't care, then, you're not going to predict anything. Okay? First prediction, if someone has no discernible ESP talent to begin with, giving them feedback probably won't do anything one way or the other. Now, what do I mean by no discernible ESP talent to begin with? I'm of the school that thinks we're probably all born with ESP, right? That's just part of being human. We have ESP abilities. But just testing people on these multiple choice guessing types of things, the vast majority of people will not show individually significant results. It'll look like what they're doing is just due to chance. So for these people, giving them a task which is going to get boring in the long run probably won't do a single thing for them. However, for those motivated people who have some talent to begin with, some of their hits are indeed going to be due to ESP, first prediction you would make is that you won't get this decline effect, which was otherwise considered almost universal in ESP testing. At the very least, it'll slow down the decline because you're learning something about how to actually use ESP. And for those who are above that talent threshold, whatever it is, they ought to get better and better with continued practice. The feedback theory also says that this so-called decline effect is actually a phenomenon known by a more precise technical name in the psychology of learning, and that is extinction. You can kill off any talent anyone has by requiring them to make repeated responses and not letting them have any feedback on how you're doing. It's like, all of you right now can close your eyes and reach out and grab your water glass because you've got a little map in your mind of where it is. You've had lots of practice at working from your mental maps and controlling your muscles. Suppose we blindfolded you and anesthetized all of your touch senses so you couldn't feel anything, and then required you to do this several hundred times and you never knew whether you actually got it or not. Your map would get messed up. You start losing track of where things were. You'd be extinguished. So the learning theory approach basically said that parapsychologists had been extinguishing, killing off the very phenomena they wanted to study. Now this may have been technically correct, but I don't think my colleagues really welcomed this particular kind of analysis. Because you had to be pretty dedicated to be a parapsychologist. It's not a career you go into for the glory and the money. And to find out you were killing off the very phenomena you wanted to study was not particularly useful. Now, incidentally, I'm not saying that ESP won't work without feedback. There have been some theories like that proposed, that feedback is a part of a precognitive loop or something like that. That's not what I'm saying at all. You can reach out for your water glass several times without looking because it's a well-learned kind of thing. But the feedback is necessary to train it in the first place and to keep your skill up once you have it. And certainly you can use ESP without feedback once in a while. So, I said paradise was gained when I moved to California, and then paradise was lost because after a couple of years at Stanford, I had to go back to the East Coast. I hadn't quite realized what good karma I'd had in coming to California by that time, so I took a job back on the East Coast, and while there at the University of Virginia, I built the first testing machine that I had built for being able to give immediate feedback conveniently. I called it ESP tester for ESP automatic tester. Wrote it up in the journal. I ran a few people with it to show that the machine worked, and then got to move back to California. Couldn't take the machine with me, but it was a small price to pay at that time. The details on that are not on the website because that machine is totally obsolete by contemporary standards, even though it worked in principle. So in order to give feedback training, as I say, cards are too cumbersome. If you want to stick with the multiple choice guessing, you need more convenient devices. The next slide shows you the first machine of this type that Russell Tart and Dave Hurt, an engineer friend of ours, built, where you had 4 possible choices, an electronic randomizer in there, and if you pushed a button to register which of the 4 choices you wanted to make, the correct thing would then light up so you'd get immediate feedback on whether you were right or wrong. And there was probably some additional reward thing when you were right. But did you have a bell or anything in there, Russell?
With a bell and with encouragement lights.
Right, yes. The next slide actually shows you the commercial prototype that evolved from this Aquarius Model 1000 machine. This is a schematic of the panel of the thing. Right, again, 4 possible, I can go over there because of the loudspeaker, 4 possible choices. And as you started to get good scores, these lights would light up. Good start, ESP ability present, useful at Las Vegas, outstanding, and horrible. This was a neat little machine because, again, when you pressed a button to register which one you thought was the correct light that had been chosen, the correct light did light up, so you got immediate feedback on whether you were right or wrong, and a bell rang if you were actually correct. And that bell was very rewarding. In fact, the rewarding quality of that bell could actually lead people into a false strategy. My son, for instance, who was about 8 years old at the time, played around with the one I had and found he could make the bell ring all the time just by pushing buttons as fast as he could. Scores were lousy, but the bell rang all the time, and that sounded good. This is an excellent training machine, and I used it in the research I'm going to describe in a minute. As it's set up initially, you can use it as a clairvoyance device. The electronic random generator in the machine has picked one of these as a target before you make your choice, so the target exists as the state of the electronics inside the machine. Or you could use it as a precognition machine, and you could select, I think it was, a tenth of a second or a half a second into the future, so that after you push your selection button, a little bit later the electronic generator then chose the target. You could also add a monitor panel to this that would display what the target was in another room, make this into a telepathy experiment where someone else would be sending what that was. This was a machine that was cutting edge at the time. This was $1,000 in late 1960s dollars. It's also the sort of machine, that had been mass-produced would be real cheap, but when they only make a few of them, this was really cutting-edge stuff. This was one of the machines I've used in my research. Russell has used it in some of his research, and a few other people used it. It's a neat little machine. I still have mine, although it's slowly falling to pieces somewhere. Now, I also came up with another machine that I use with my students as experimenters at the University of California. If I could have the next slide, please. Which, because it had 10 possible choices, I called with the mysterious name of the 10-choice trainer, or the TCT. In this machine, there was a little green light in the center of the panel. When that light came on, it told the recipient that the experimenter in another room, this was always set up in the telepathy mode, the experimenter in another room had randomly chosen one of the 10 possibilities marked by the cards 1 to 10 as the target and was trying to telepathically send it. And the receiver, the recipient's job, was, again, to decide which one it was, presses the switch corresponding to that, and the right light would come on immediately, and if they were right, a bell would also ring. We really got into bells. People really seem to like that. So this is an example of the recipient's panel, and notice how she has her hand out over these things. This will become very significant in a moment, because it turns out a lot of people treated this as a dowsing machine. They were running their hands around this circle looking for some special feeling. Now, electronically, it was designed so that there was no electrical difference between any spatial different part of the board. But a lot of people took this as a sort of dowsing task. The next slide shows you that the sender, who was off in another room, not only had an identical panel that they selected a target on, the top one, number 1, the ace has been selected in this case, but also the sender has a TV screen connected to a camera that's focused on the recipient's panel so that the sender can see the hand movements. The next slide shows you a hit in that particular case. The receiver has selected the right one. Could I get a drink of water? If I come forward for it, I know I'll make the feedback happen on this sort of thing. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Gail. You're an angel. Now, I'll tell you one of the most interesting things that came out of this, and this is an example of what could have gone on to become really interesting in the almost new paradigm, but didn't, now that remote viewing has pretty much replaced that. And that is, it was quite clear sometimes that at one level, the recipient knew the right answer, and then they pushed the wrong button. There were innumerable instances when the experimenter sender would see, they put the ready light on, the recipient's hand would immediately come from their lap to right over the right button, and they'd move a little to the side and come back to it, a little to the other side and come back to it, and go all around the circle and stop on it to the side and come back to it, side and come back to it, and then suddenly push another button that was wrong. That's when we all had fantasies about adding the electric shock button. Because they knew it, damn it. And this also fitted in with my thinking at the time, because it was quite clear that you can receive an ESP impression on some unconscious level. Some part of your mind, your body knows the correct answer, but your conscious mind doesn't know it. I guess I should tell you the amusing example of how I came across that idea, because I've been hoping for 40 years for somebody to repeat the experiment, and nobody has. Long before this, I had decided that ESP works best when the event to be transmitted by ESP is important. Somebody dies that you love or something, something with a little more pizzazz than this is a wave or a star or something like that. It's hard to kill off people in the laboratory just to produce good results, and nowadays with human subjects it's impossible. But I did set up an experiment where subjects were in a room normally used for sensory deprivation, and their physiology was being monitored, their heart rate, their skin resistance, their brain waves and whatnot. And these people didn't know it was an ESP experiment. They were told it was a subliminal perception experiment. which was technically correct. It was just sort of sub. They were just told, once in a while, random times, you may get some kind of subliminal stimulus. If you think that's happened, push the button on the arm of your chair, otherwise just relax and sit here in the dark. The subliminal stimulus was me off in another shielded room at random intervals receiving a severe electrical shock. At which times I had a very strong investment in responding. I was trying to set it up so I could go from a calm state. I read a book otherwise and tried to not think about what might be coming. And then I would instantly go to an extremely aroused and involved state and then try to calm down immediately after the 2-second shock wore off. Well, what I found was people's conscious guesses as to when something had happened were completely a chance. When they pushed that button showed no relation to when the shocks had occurred. But they showed significant physiological responses to when the shocks had occurred. So it's an early example of you can get it on some level, but it doesn't make it up to your conscious mind. So here with this choice trainer, we had innumerable examples where it was obvious they knew it, and then they pushed the wrong button. Okay, but at any rate, we're focusing on the learning question here. This 10-choice trainer and the 4-choice Aquarius trainer were used in my own studies of feedback learning. And notice what important differences between them. Remember I said a problem with any multiple choice test is you get a certain amount of false feedback. That is, you're right by chance alone a certain proportion of the time, which lets you make correlations between your state and being successful that are false. That had nothing to do with it. That was just a chance hit that time. Well, with a 4-choice trainer, of course, you're getting those false hits, those confusions, 25% of the time. With a 10-choice trainer, you're only getting them 10% of the time. On the other hand, if you want to think about in terms of a task being rewarding, you're getting rewarded at least 25% of the time on a 4-choice machine, but only 10% of the time on the other one. So it's a psychological difference. Now, before I started this study, there were a few other studies in the literature on feedback, which when I looked at them, I thought provided some support for the idea that feedback would enable people to learn. But they weren't really extensive studies done the way I wanted them to. So when I regained paradise and came back from the East Coast to teach at UC Davis, back in 1972, I started studies with the 10-choice trainer and the Aquarius machine. I'll just give you some quick highlights of it here. For those of you who want details, another paranormal event happened. The results were published in book form by the University of Chicago Press. I was absolutely amazed when they accepted it. They had very tough referees, but it was amazing to have such a mainstream, straight university press publish the results. The next slide shows you the floor plan of the laboratory setup I had at Davis. There were the possibility of 2 experiments going at a time. In the lower left-hand corner, I guess I have to explain it because you can't see a thing in the back, right? In one room is the receiver of the 10-choice trainer, and the room across the hall inside another shielded room is the sender with the TV monitor, and then from outside that same room up to another room across the hall is the 4-choice trainer thing. This particular lab arrangement isn't important, except just to show you these people were isolated in terms of ordinary sensory impulse. The next slide shows you how I dealt with the talent threshold thing. Remember I said you don't expect any learning to take place unless you've got people with some initial talent to begin with, but most people, if you give them a multiple choice ESP type test, don't show significant results. I needed talented people. Well, I was teaching in a university. Now, how many of you majored in psychology or are psychologists? Okay, so you know that psychology is the study of the college sophomore by former college sophomores for the benefit of future college sophomores. So I can actually have lots of college sophomores available. So my students and I, first off, we did a 3-stage study. We first off did large screening tests. We would beg the last 10 minutes of somebody's class of when they could give a group ESP test, walk out of there with 20, 30, 50, 100 sets of results from people. Now, when you do lots of tests like that, some people are going to score significantly on an individual level by chance alone. 5% of them, if you use the 5% level of significance. So, since we didn't want to test people who had artifactually gotten there and didn't really have any talent, there was a second study, what we called the confirmation study, where the people who scored high in the first stage were invited in for individual sessions on the 10-choice trainer and the Aquarius machine.
And if they continued to show significance on either of these machines in here, it was very unlikely that they were there just by chance alone. They got invited to the confirmation study where they did 20 runs of 25 trials each on either the 4-choice Aquarius machine or the 10-choice trainer, whichever one they had preferred as a result of their experience in the confirmation study. The general result, without bothering with any detail on it, is we saw lots of ESP, we saw no declines, and we saw some people showing signs of getting better. Not too much better, because one thing that became clear was that 20 sessions was probably enough to start the learning process in this particular kind of thing, but probably not enough to finish it. We saw indications, for instance, that a long interval between sessions would allow what had been learned to fall off, whereas if the sessions came within a day or two, they could build on the previous session and whatnot. So there were a lot of hints for further possibilities here. To give you one little example of the kind of results, the next slide shows the results of the 10-choice trainer, which again probably nobody but me can see. And the result of that, for instance, was the best subject got 124 hits when only 50 would be expected by chance, and the odds against that were 2 times 10 to the minus 28, astronomical odds against chance. This person was hitting 2.5 times above chance. This is extremely impressive on a difficult task like the 10-choice trainer. 5 of the 10 subjects who completed the study on the 10-choice trainer all showed these extremely significant kind of results here. These results, incidentally, many of you have read about without knowing that you read about it. How many of you have read Schnabel's book, Remote Viewers? Remember the section about how put-off sent some results about the NX missile system to Washington, which hopefully resulted in that multi-billion-dollar boondoggle being canceled? Some of you may be too young to remember the NX missile system. We didn't want the Russians to be able to take out all our missiles on a first strike, so the plan came up that for every missile we build something like 10 missile silos, and with a system of railroad tracks in between and covered cars, and we'd be constantly shuttling all our missiles back and forth at random between all these sites, and the Russians didn't have that many missiles to be able to take them all out, and that's how we defend against the first strike. And the cost was astronomical. Well, Hal Puthoff took this particular data from the 10-choice trainer, showing that people could get this level of accuracy on this multiple-choice guessing type thing, and applied it to show that if the Russians could get results comparable to this, they could guess so accurately as to where the missile was actually, which silo was actually in, that they would indeed have a first strike capability. I hope that was one of the factors that resulted in that multi-million-dollar boondoggle going away. These initial results were very encouraging. I had views of a new paradigm where we taught people to use ESP instead of just tested for them. That at least for some people who had some initial talent, we taught them to show very high reliable levels of ESP from which we could go on and study the nature of ESP. That is, we have our parapsychological battery, our steady current of psi, and then we can find out what affected it, what it meant, and so forth, and make enormous progress in research. We would figure out things like, what is the best number of choices? Is 10 choices better than 4 choices, or binary choices, or maybe you should be guessing 1 out of 100? How could you individualize this to particular people's patterns and so forth? A form of analytical overlay I found in this data. I found, for instance, the people who were logical about guessing their choices showed the worst scores, because this was a random system. If you were logically trying to figure out what was likely to come next, that just got in the way of using your intuition to use ESP. But, as you know, it didn't quite happen. I was able to do a second study, weren't able to get the kind of talented people in the first one. I also hired someone who was not particularly good at getting psychic results, and it sort of fizzled in my lab. I got interested in other things, studies of consciousness and whatnot, and also the remote viewing was coming along, which got me really interested. Some other people did it. This is the part that I've still never been able to figure out. I don't know how many times I have written down that feedback won't help anybody unless they have some talent level to begin with. Many other parapsychologists went out and got a bunch of totally untalented people and gave them feedback and showed it had no effect, which was exactly what I predicted, and they interpreted it to mean that feedback was of no value. Okay, that gets into the whole topic of resistance to psychic phenomena among parapsychologists as well as among people in general, but since we're running so late tonight, I think I'll skip over that one. It was an almost new paradigm. If it had worked, you would all be sitting in front of customized ESP teaching machines instead of doing remote viewing. But it didn't quite come off. Instead, remote viewing came in. Now, remote viewing is sexier. There's no doubt about that. I mean, describing mysterious things at unknown locations really beats star, waves, whatever. I say that the interest in that kind of runs into the ground after a while, no doubt about it. But I think there's another important factor in remote viewing that hasn't been looked at as explicitly as it can, and that is the remote viewing incorporated exactly what I and Russell had said about the importance of feedback. Remote viewing almost always involves feedback about the target. Now, it's not immediate feedback, usually in the sense that you get feedback within half a second after you make your particular response. But it's unconfused feedback in the sense, you don't do 25 remote viewings and then are taken out to see 25 different targets and you have to figure, was number 14 the one where I felt such and such a way? There's usually, especially in the early days, you had a single remote viewing event in a day, you went immediately to the target afterwards, so how you felt and acted during that time was still relatively discrete in your mind, and you could make a comparison. Well, I was wrong about this part, but right about that part, and this time when I felt absolutely certain, everything I said there was wrong, so I got to watch out for that feeling of absolute certainty, but here when I was surprised it worked, I should look for feelings of surprise and so forth. Feedback was incorporated, and I suspect Russell had a lot to do with getting that feedback incorporated in there as a standard part of the remote viewing bit. And even in the things where you're trained on multiple targets in a single session, there's feedback after each one instead of having it confused with many things happening in between. I've never heard of anybody talk about decline in remote viewing. Okay, in the card guessing test days, people talked about decline effects all the time. I can't remember ever hearing anybody talk about it. Now, I've never done a formal survey, and I hope to be prepared to do some kind of more formal survey then, but it's my impression that once you learn to do some remote viewing, you either get better or you stay relatively constant in what you can do instead of having your abilities slowly decline. We can have the slide off, but leave the fan running, and the lights back on, incidentally. That'll help keep people from going to sleep. Yeah, I learned that, you turn the lights off, it's very easy to go to sleep. So, while I was frustrated in one sense with the original old paradigm approach that providing immediate feedback would demonstrate learning, would revolutionize the field and all that, and I got left at a point in my own research and with that with others where I had to say, well, maybe. I mean, there's certainly some support for it, but not what I call conclusive proof. But then the paradigm shifted. Remote viewing is the sexy thing to do. Feedback is almost always present in remote viewing. Nobody talks about decline. So maybe it's worked out after all. Now, I'm not going to say much more about it. I don't really do laboratory research anymore. I've gotten to the point where I'm more interested in the implications of psychic abilities than the applications, although, I can get all technically on the applications quite a bit, but I'm really more curious about what they mean. Some of you may know my Body, Mind, Spirit book, my most recent book, in which I got some parapsychologists to come out from behind the methodology, the scientific rigor, and talk of anomalies, and talk about what this means in terms of our spiritual nature. To me, that's exciting. Parapsychology is the fundamental scientific ground we have to show that we should take the idea of a spiritual reality seriously. Not that you should believe everything labeled spiritual. There's lots of nonsense in that field like any others. But hey, prayer's not so weird an idea when you know human beings can show telepathy that doesn't seem as affected by space and time. So that's what really excites me now. So even though the paradigm didn't turn out quite the way I thought it would, it's turned out to be very interesting. And Jack is already very late in starting his PK party. Paul, what's our timing now? Do I have time for 3 questions?
Let's say we have time for 2 or 3 questions.
2 or 3
Make
questions.
them short.
Okay, and keep it short, and I suppose I should repeat them for the sake of the tape recording. The 2 or 3 most important questions. Don't be embarrassed. Yes.
You said you were interested in the implications of ESP. Name off a few of the implications you think are important.
A few of the important implications for ESP, non-locality, like Larry Dossi talked about so nicely this morning. You know, I am a dualist in a philosophical sense, and it's clear to me that mind is not equivalent to body in the ordinary Newtonian sense. And whatever that mind is, you can't just say it's here in the brain. It's spread out in time and space in some important kind of fashion. Moral implications from it. Okay, all the religions tell you, be good, or else. Okay, and if they can't appeal to your self-interest, appeal to your fear. Well, why should I be good? Okay, the scientistic materialist paradigm we're in really says, you know, consciousness is nothing but the brain. The brain's in here. Each of us is ultimately isolated. And so if you're in pain and that bothers me, all I need to do is look away because you're separate from me. Now, wait a minute, if telepathy works, if non-locality works, if we really have these deep connections, then there's no such thing as your pain that has nothing to do with me. Your welfare is my welfare. The whole idea of spiritual evolution to work for the good of all sentient beings has a basis in parapsychology that says, take this idea seriously. Is that good enough? Well, I want to think we're all the good out of the sheer goodness of our hearts. It helps to have a little bit of knowledge that makes it seem a more sensible thing to do. Given the difficulties, we can use all the encouragement we can get. Maybe I should end on that note. That would be a hard one.